Sometimes, as I look for games to review for this show, I'll stumble upon something that really surprises me. And it's fair to say that, looking at all the different platforms I aim to cover, some of the biggest surprises come from the earlier home console generations. For one thing, it's surprising how many conversions of popular arcade games made their way to these systems, and for another, it's quite remarkable how many of those conversions managed to preserve the feel and gameplay, if not the presentation, of their parent coin-ops. Admittedly, the best of these are usually the ones that skewed towards simple gameplay concepts before they were considered for home release. But the flip side of this is that sometimes a game shows up that feels so polished and cleverly designed that it comes as a genuine shock to learn that it didn't originate in the arcade. Like Activision's Beamrider, which I'm sure wouldn't look out of place in a full-size arcade cabinet. This game first released on Mattel's Intellivision console in 1983, and would subsequently be converted to play on a whole range of popular consoles and home computers, including the Atari 2600, which by that time was already starting to look a bit old hat. With its pseudo 3D graphics and, for the time, comparatively complex design, it's easy to imagine that Beamrider would have been a challenging game to port over to the console. But let's not forget that its publisher had a knack for consistently eking the very best from it. And once again, they would prove themselves apt to the task. Beamrider's gameplay is pretty simple, or at least it starts that way. You control a spaceship at the foot of the screen that can manoeuvre left and right across lanes on the interstellar faster-than-light superhighway, or whatever the blue grid-like playing area is supposed to be. Enemies appear on the distant horizon as tiny white dots and then come zipping down the screen towards you, zigzagging across lanes and sometimes firing projectiles that you'll obviously need to dodge. Thumbing the 2600 controller's single button fires back at them with what the game manual imaginatively calls a laser lariat, because apparently laser beams are too last century and not a sexy enough concept for this game. But that oddly named space boomstick isn't the only weapon you've got at your disposal. Pushing up on the joystick will launch a torpedo, which is the only way to deal with certain enemies. You'll need to use those sparingly though, as you're given just 3 for each attack wave. The way attack waves work is that you're tasked to shoot down a set number of enemies in each stage, or sector as they're called here, before you can advance to the next. After you've cleared your kill quota, you get a chance to take out that sector's mothership, which appears in the distance out of range of your laser, moving from one side of the screen to the other. When it appears, you've got until it reaches the other side of the screen to take it out with a torpedo, but during this tiny window of opportunity, you'll be harassed by fast-moving space scumbags who home in on you and try to block your shot. If you succeed, you'll get a big points bonus, and if you don't, well, provided you survive the encounter, you'll move on to the next sector regardless, and repeat the whole process again. But as you advance to new sectors, the game starts throwing new enemy types at you. Very early on, the game introduces falling space rocks, which can't be blasted with your regular shot and have to be dodged, or, if you get in a bind, torpedoed. And later, those homing space scumbags that were hanging out with the motherships before will appear in the main game, as well as other critters who bob and weave all over the space lanes. That's basically as much as there is to Beamrider. You shoot, you dodge, and you shoot some more, and then dodge again, but not necessarily in that order. There's no real object to the game other than to rack up points and go for a high score, and maybe see how far into it you can get. But what do you expect? It's an early 1980s no-bit video game. You've got to know the drill with these things by now, surely. As I mentioned earlier, Beamrider has found its way onto a number of different platforms since its Intellivision debut, and I've been lucky enough to play several, but not all of those different versions. It's interesting to see how the game translates each time, and from what I gather, its developer, Dave Rolfe, did indeed have a pretty hard time porting it to the 2600, so a few compromises had to be made during the process. Not that you'd necessarily guess if you didn't know any better, because this version of the game is fantastic. Visually, it's quite a bit different and less detailed than its Intellivision counterpart, and it controls differently too, which shouldn't come as a surprise, because the Atari's infamously chunky controller isn't as well appointed as the Intellivision's. That whole business of jerking up on the joystick to fire torpedoes is actually a workaround to accommodate the fact that you're only working with a single fire button. but in practice it works well enough. I've certainly played games on the 2600 that had wackier controls. It just means that if you're concerned about experiencing the game as it was originally intended to be played, the Intellivision or maybe even the ColecoVision versions are probably the ones to go for. That said, you might have an easier time tracking down the 2600 version, especially considering it's made a few appearances on the popular range of Atari flashback mini consoles. And for what it's worth, if you found yourself unable to play it any other way, I think you could do far worse than that. In fact, even though this is maybe not the purest representation of the game, I think Beamrider on the Atari 2600 may just be my favourite version of the ones I've played. Maybe it's the Atari fanboy in me talking here, but there's just something about this version that gives it its own sense of identity. Something about its audiovisual stylings that makes it uniquely appealing and gives it a certain sense of character. Its graphics might not be especially detailed, even by the admittedly humble standards of Atari's little wood-grain console, but there's a leanness and cleverness to its design, with excellent use of colour and forced perspective, that gives it a pleasantly trippy aesthetic. And everything moves around on screen very smoothly, with no flicker. By 2600 standards, I think this is a really great looking game, and I really like the sound too. It's got that magical lo-fi flavour that just fits these old games like a glove. So we've established that the presentation is excellent, but of course what's really important is how well it plays. And what makes Beamrider fun and memorable is the way it ramps up in pace as you clear stages. After a while, it really makes you work for your points. Make no mistake, this game will keep you on your toes. It starts off easy enough, but as you progress and new enemy types appear, the distinctly different behaviour they exhibit means you'll have to adapt your approach on the fly. Things really start to get tricky around Sector 7 or 8, by which point you're facing a broader range of faster, more aggressive blobs and blocks that are all out to kill you. Once you've got this far, it all starts to get a bit frantic. Even the extra life pickups that show up now and then are out to get you if you shoot them by accident, whereupon they'll turn into a wad of falling shrapnel that'll cost you a life if it hits you. So it doesn't pay to get too trigger happy. I think what marks Beamrider out as exceptional is that there's more for the player to consider in any given moment than you'll find in a lot of apparently similar action games for the 2600. I love how it eases you in and shows you the basics during its early stages, before gradually adding more and more elements into the mix. Eventually, you find yourself having to think more about what you're doing, and survival depends on developing a good understanding of the different enemies and their particular attack patterns. I like that a lot, because it keeps the game fun and lends it a certain energetic feel that makes it exciting to play. It's also really addictive. I've sometimes mentioned that older games from years gone by don't always feel like the kind of thing you can play for more than a short sitting, but this one doesn't fit that description. Since I discovered Beamrider, it's become one of my go-to games for a quick session at the end of my lunch breaks, and I've noticed that lunchtimes tend to go on for a lot longer whenever I plug it in. When folks ask me what the appeal of playing games on a decades-old console is, Beamrider has become one of the titles I point to by way of explanation. Despite its origins as a home console game, it feels very much to me like it's cut from the same cloth as enduring arcade classics like, off the top of my head, Tempest or Gyrus. Conceptually and mechanically, just like those games, it's simple enough to make it immediately accessible and instantly fun to play, but playing it well takes a great deal of skill. Where Beamrider really excels as far as I'm concerned though, is in the way it adds variety to its basic premise of shoot this, dodge that, with its assortment of different enemies and their attack patterns. These mean players need to do more than just stab at the fire button mindlessly to advance through sectors, and when you combine this with the need for sharp reflexes as the game draws on, you've got the recipe for an unusual little shooter that's tough to put down. But those positive qualities are common to most versions of Beamrider that I've played. The question here is whether there's any point in picking up the Atari 2600 port specifically, and I'd say yes, there absolutely is. I can't stress enough how smartly turned out it is. From its coolly abstract visuals and classic sounds, down to its razor-sharp gameplay, everything gels together on this version in a way that feels uniquely Atari, if that makes any sense at all. I can't get enough of this one. It's an absolutely fantastic technical achievement on the console, tons of fun to play, and I'd say a must-have cartridge for the collection.